Introducing Anne Frank, Exchanging Ideas Through Writing, a documentary by Kendall Clark, Emily Smith, Molly Evans, and Brianna Schindler. Junior Division 2016, Exploration, Encounter, Exchange, Historical Context.
It was September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland. German forces attacked Poland on land and from the air as Adolf Hitler fought to regain lost territory and ultimately rule Poland. This was the beginning of World War II. The Polish forces were under-equipped and attempted to take the Germans head-on. The orderly state of its military was simply no match for the overwhelming and modern German forces. The war caused thousands of Polish troops to be taken into captivity. Most Polish people simply surrendered to the Soviets to avoid being captured by the Germans. Once Hitler had a base of operations within Poland, he immediately began setting up forces to demolish all enemies of his Nazi ideology, whether racial, religious, or political. One of Hitler's most infamous ways to demolish his enemies was to establish the hated concentration camps. One of the first concentration camps built was Buchenwald, in east-central Germany. The concentration camp opened in 1937. The Schutzstaffel, otherwise known as the SS, was a major paramilitary organization under Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The SS was an elite organization with the Nazi Party that served as Hitler's personal guard. The group also included police units and special forces. The SS also surrounded to imprison resistant fighters, former government officials of German-occupied countries, and foreign forced laborers. Many of the early people at Buchenwald were political prisoners. Many Jews were sent to Buchenwald because the camp was famous for its cruel punishments, gruesome murders, and its large size. Buchenwald was one of the largest of all the Jewish concentration camps. Each camp had an SS Death Head unit. The SS Death Head unit was the officers in charge of each camp, and the ones who sent people to death. In 1941, Gestapo agents started to order Jewish families out of their apartments into trucks headed for the east. Most of the trucks headed for the concentration camps in Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Russia. Over time, many Jews went into hiding to escape the horror of being sent to death. A great example of this is the famous Frank family in Frankfurt, Germany. The four members of the Frank family hid in a hidden addition to a building, otherwise known as an annex, located in Amsterdam. The Frank family consisted of a mother named Edith, a father named Otto, an older sister named Margaret, and the youngest of them all, the famous Anne Frank. The Frank family was Jewish. To avoid being captured, they tried to flee the country, and when that didn't work, they decided to go into hiding with a few family friends. 8 Jews were hiding in the annex, which included the Frank family, the family of the Van Pels, who the Franks knew prior to the annex. Herman Van Pels was the father, who was married to the mother, Augusta Van Pels, and their son, Peter Van Pels. 4 months later, Fritz Pfeffer joined the rest in the very cramped annex. Fritz Pfeffer was a Jewish family friend to the Franks. The youngest daughter of the Frank family was Anne, who was born on June 12, 1929, in the German town of Frankfurt. Anne Frank's family decided to leave Germany, just like any other German Jews, because of Adolf Hitler's rise to power. They then moved to Amsterdam. When Hitler increased his power, they then tried to immigrate to England and the United States, but their attempt failed. The best option left to the Frank family was to go into hiding. The Frank family and their friends lived at the top of a business building in the hidden annex behind a bookshelf. While the shop was running downstairs, the members of the annex had to be extremely quiet. They had to tiptoe. They couldn't close the doors because they were afraid they might creak, and they couldn't flush the toilet or take showers. The fugitives could only get downstairs on Saturdays and during lunch breaks for the workers, and not during business hours. Most of the day they had to sit still. Everyone was terrified. Terror filled their bodies as they wondered if they would ever survive this horrible Nazi invasion. The families had much help from the people that worked downstairs. For example, one secretary named Mick Pease helped with a lot of procedures and sneaked food to them that they needed to survive. She and others also helped sure the Jews were safe during business hours. Throughout the war and while they were in the annex, the youngest daughter of the Frank family, Anne, recorded many things in a diary. She recorded the thoughts and feelings about the war that she had and other things in her diary. Anne knew what her goals and ambitions were. As she wrote, "Although I'm only 14, I know quite well what I want. I know who is right and who is wrong. I have my opinions, my own ideas and principles, and although it may sound pretty mad coming from an adolescent, I feel more of a person than a child. I feel quite independent of anyone." She had a dream to become a writer, but didn't know that once she died and her diary was discovered, that her dream of becoming a writer would come true. Little did she know that her diary was destined to become famous throughout the world. Anne wrote strongly in her diary about her ideas, views, and opinions. Many of her entries were about the annex, just as this famous line from her diary: "I see the 8 of us in the annex as if we were a patch of blue sky surrounded by menacing black clouds. The perfectly round spot on which we're standing is still safe, but the clouds are moving in on us, and the ring between us and the approaching danger is being pulled tighter and tighter. We're surrounded by darkness and danger. In our desperate search for finding a way out, we keep bumping into each other. We look at the fighting down below and the peace and beauty up above. In the meantime, we've been cut off by the dark and massive clouds, so that we can only go neither up nor down. It looms before us like an impenetrable wall, trying to catch us, but not yet able to. I can only cry out and implore, 'Oh, ring, ring, open wide and let us out.'" Anne's words moved many people to tears because of how relatable her experience was to thousands. On August 4th, 1944, started out as any other dreadful day of hiding for the Frank family, but it soon turned out to be much worse. Around noon, Nazi officers broke down the Fox bookshelf and ran up the stairs into the annex. With guns trained on their heads, all residents froze and dropped everything they were doing. For the unthinkable had happened. After 25 months of hiding, they were all captured by the Nazis. The residents of the annex tried to say their last goodbyes in between tears as they loaded onto separate train cars. Herman Van Pels, Otto Frank, Fritz Pfeffer, and Peter Van Pels managed to stay together. They were all sent to Auschwitz I. Augusta Van Pels, Edith Frank, Margaret Frank, and Anne Frank were all sent to Auschwitz II. After a few weeks at Auschwitz I, the weak and the sick were weeded out and killed. Unfortunately, that included Herman Van Pels. 4 months after they were captured, Fritz Pfeffer died from sickness. Peter Van Pels was moved from Auschwitz I to the Mauthausen concentration camp, where he died 2 months later. Out of the 4 men that were hiding in the annex, only Otto Frank's, Anne's father, had survived. Nearly a year after they were captured, and 3 concentration camps later, Augusta Van Pels was murdered. Her killer is unknown. In the weeks following Augustus's death, Edith Frank fell ill and died. Anna Margaret Frank was separated from their mother shortly before she died and were both sent to a different concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen. Just weeks before the camp was liberated, Anna and Margaret both came down with typhus and passed away, days in between each other. Otto Frank, Anne's father, was the only person from the annex to survive World War II. Otto Frank returned to Amsterdam, hoping to find Edith, Margaret, and Anne alive. On his journey, he was told that his wife had passed away in one of the concentration camps. Heartbroken, Otto Frank held on to the string of hope that his daughters were alive and well. The first place Otto went back when he got back to Amsterdam was to Miep Gies in her husband's home. There he learned that Anne and Margaret had passed away. With no house to stay in, he lived with Miep Gies and her husband until he got back on his feet. With no family, Otto Frank lived his following days in gloom and sadness. One day, Miep Gies gave him a present that cheered him up, Anne's diary. Miep Gies returned it back to the secret annex after they were taken and took Anne's diary, holding on to it all these years and hoping Anne would someday come back for it. Overcome with emotions, Otto took the diary, wondering if he should open it. Days went by as Otto stared at Anne's diary, debating whether or not to open it. The day finally came when he couldn't stand it anymore. Otto read it. It contained page after page after page of heartbreaking letters, feelings, and emotion. Otto claimed that he never knew Anne could write this deeply. Anne Frank's diary was filled with everything from her thoughts about being stuck in the annex, for dreams later in life, what she thought about people, especially her secret boyfriend, Peter Van Pels, who was in the annex with them. Anne wrote that she wanted to be an author, so Otto Frank made that wish come true. He took Anne's diary and submitted it to many different publishers. They all turned him down, until April 3, 1946, when an article was published about it on the cover of the Dutch newspaper Het Parool. From there, Anne's diary quickly gained interest with many top publishing companies. With many companies breathing down his neck, Otto Frank finally chose the publishing company Contact in Amsterdam to publish his daughter's diary. A year later, on June 14th, 1942, Anne Frank's diary was finally published as The Diary of a Young Girl. Anne's diary had become one of the most powerful memoirs in the Holocaust, and even of all time. The diary has been translated into 67 languages, and over 300 million copies were sold. Her story reached the hearts of millions, as it still does. Although she wasn't there to see it, Anne Frank's dream to become an author came true. Later, Otto said, if she had been here, Anne would have been so proud. The significance of Anne Frank and her diary of the Holocaust in the world have been amazing. When people think of the Holocaust of World War II, many people think only of the torture and deaths of the adults, but Anne Frank's story changed that for Jews and for the world. Because of her story, everyone will remember what kids went through too. Children were starved, whipped, abused, and beaten, and even killed. Parents would never know what happened to their children and if they were alive or dead. Terror filled their hearts when hundreds of thousands of Jews were added to the death list every day. It was hard work and torture for adults, and that meant it was even worse for kids. Anne Frank showed through her writing the horror of what the victims went through from the point of view of a kid. Anne Frank is the most well-known captured child Jew of all time. She is the symbol of the torture that all kids went through because of how they felt, thought, and what religion they believed in. She is a symbol of a girl with an amazing education and talent that she never got to live out as the freedom as a well-educated woman. She believed that the best in people had a bright light in the darkness that would eventually take over. One of the most famous quotes nowadays came from Anne Frank's diary. In spite of everything, I still believe people are really good at heart. World War II ended with unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. On the 8th of May, 1945, the Allies accepted Germany's surrender about a week after Adolf Hitler committed suicide. Everyone stopped hiding, and no one had to fear of the Nazis any longer. Even though Anne and her family weren't around to see it, the world will always remember how Anne Frank and the Nazis explored, exchanged, and encountered each other through history.